It's been a while since I've sent a video on a graph, and given that some people now follow this on a podcast, I'll do my best to describe what we're looking at before I analyse what it all means. This is a scatter graph where the y-axis is millions of copies sold of Nintendo Switch games. The x-axis is time, the number of days into Switch's life a game was released. Therefore, on the far left of the graph, we have dots for One to Switch near the bottom, with its 3.74 million last reported sales, a blob halfway up for Zelda Breath of the Wild at 32.81 million, and just slightly away from the left-hand axis, releasing 56 days of the Switch being on the market, is Mario Kart 8 Deluxe. Now, I'm sure you can already see some natural limitations for a graph like this, as well as how it can be extremely interesting to deep dive. Not all of Nintendo's results are recorded, and they only do this if games reach 1 million copies sold in a financial year. This usually only suppresses the very minor games, but there may be some oddities. Notably, games like Xenoblade Chronicles X Definitive Edition, which could be low selling but also releases on the borderline between financial years, may be prone to having its numbers significantly underreported, as if, for example, it sold 900,000 in March 2025 and 900,000 in the 2025 to 26 fiscal year. It could easily rack up pretty close to 2 million in sales, certainly within a few years of it being released, but not show up on Nintendo's data at all. That's an extreme scenario, but obviously the published data Nintendo provides isn't a full accounting for the success or failures of their games. Also, the later titles have evidently had far less time to sell, and while most games, especially for a mature system like the Switch, sell most of their units in the first few weeks or months, a game like, for example, Super Mario Party Jamboree, which has clearly been positioned to have a second wind on Switch 2, well, that title's sales might be expected to rise considerably several years, or at least several months, after its first release. Still, while it may have some drawbacks in terms of fine detail, I think this graph presents a useful frame through which to consider our topic today: how Nintendo spaces out its evergreen titles through a generation. Because while Nintendo produces many games in each console generation, they are certainly not all equally valuable to them. The graph shows a cluster of dots along the bottom in the 1 to 5 million sales range, like a sandy shore. And remember that many games which never reached 1 million sold in a financial year aren't even given a dot at all, while soaring high in the skies above are those handful of outlying massive sellers. It's possible to draw a diagonal line from Mario Kart 8 Deluxe in the top left corner, through Animal Crossing New Horizon in the middle, to Pokemon Scarlet and Violet, Zelda Tears of the Kingdom, and Super Mario Bros. Wonder, which respectively netted 27 million, 22 million, and 16 million copies sold, releasing evenly over a period of 12 months. The latter three games form a kind of constellation in the sky, as does the surprising period just after 500 days, where the sandy base of games in Nintendo's beach floor disappears for a few months, and every game seems to be a pretty huge seller. This, of course, is the crazy window where we had Super Mario Party, Pokemon Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee, Super Smash Bros., and New Super Mario Bros. U Deluxe, all in relatively quick succession, a brief window of time that dragged the 2018 to 19 fiscal year from being a rather bleak affair for the Switch output to being a time of some landmark games hitting the market, even if titles like Super Mario Party and New Super Mario Bros. U Deluxe felt like more minor key releases at the time. There's another echo of this in the year or so following the Switch OLED's release, where we have Mario Party Superstars, Pokemon Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl, Pokemon Legends Arceus, Nintendo Switch Sports, and Splatoon 3, all carving a little path through the teens of millions over the period of about 10 or 11 months. There are a couple of periods in the Switch's life where the skies of the scatter graph are empty, however. Firstly, there's the gap after Animal Crossing New Horizon. Animal Crossing was the seventh game in barely over 3 years that would be destined to cross the 20 million threshold. No game would replicate this feat for nearly 3 years, not until Pokemon Scarlet and Violet at the end of 2022. Of course, there is a rather simple explanation for this, which is the COVID pandemic, but that wouldn't necessarily be wholly reliable as a reason. After all, the pandemic surely did have an impact on the progress of Nintendo's game development, and it also allowed them to be far less aggressive with pushing major titles out the door because it turbocharged Switch sales and gave Nintendo a comfort blanket that they had been unaccustomed to after the lean years of the 3DS and Wii U. I think Animal Crossing New Horizon was the last game that was developed with a real sense of make or break urgency at the company. It's also possible, though, that the gap reflects a decision not to pull the trigger on a much speculated upon Switch Pro mid-generation console, which was a more powered up model. The kind of mid-gen model, by the way, that they were more than happy to wheel out for 3DS and even the original DS. We know that Mario Kart World was at some stage in its development journey scheduled for the original Switch. It feels conceivable to me that Mario Kart World and Zelda Tears of the Kingdom could both at one stage have been targeting the late 2021 to 2022 window, with titles like Switch Sports releasing perhaps a little earlier as well. These changes would have gone some way to disguise the gap in top tier evergreens, and we also mustn't rule out the possibility that some of these games were completed earlier than we suppose and clung on to by Nintendo for various reasons. Perhaps testing became a difficult bottleneck during the pandemic, but also I suspect that they didn't feel the need to rush out potential evergreens like Switch Sports when they were already benefiting from very high demand for their legacy titles from the surge of new owners. Why cannibalize your own sales in this way? The extent to which Nintendo can control its timings may be overestimated as well. Sure, the Pokemon Company are incredibly schedule oriented, but even they seem to have realized that a 3-year schedule during a pandemic for Pokemon Scarlet and Violet was a little too aggressive to meet the expectations of quality for many customers and indeed for Nintendo themselves. The headline sales didn't seem to suffer too badly, but I, for one, as a rather casual Pokemon fan at the best of times, decided to skip the game until a better experience was on offer. And I'll be kind of intrigued to see if Scarlet and Violet, a game which, apart from its functionality, seemed to get very good plaudits, gets a subtle but still detectable late surge in sales from players coming to it on the Nintendo Switch 2. Still, most of Nintendo's games are reliant on the principle that they are released when they're done. There have definitely been times when Nintendo has had to rush something out the door in a panic, but these are usually the subject of some regret. As wonderful as Zelda Wind Waker is, it remains forever afterward a game that could have been that much more perfect if they hadn't had that strict deadline to meet. I don't think it's just creative pride that makes Nintendo cleave to quality even when time is against them. They also know that these franchises and titles can be sources of profit for years and decades after, as the use of Wind Waker as the headline game for the GameCube Nintendo Classics app in the Switch 2 launch direct ably demonstrates. The Wii U is littered with titles that would barely register on this chart for their Wii U numbers, but on the Switch performed far more respectably. Still, I think if you wanted to locate the Switch Lite and Switch OLED release dates on this chart, you wouldn't have too hard a time. They were released on days 931 and 1680 of the Switch's life respectively, or just go to the points where the sky is looking suddenly much more crowded with superstar sellers. We should acknowledge that Nintendo has no way of knowing for absolute certain which games will break big and which will fade into obscurity. Super Mario Maker's more than 8 million sold is better than a poke in the eye with a sharp stick, but probably was under what they might have hoped for a major 2D Mario entry, following up probably the Wii U's biggest cult hit. On the other hand, as successful as Animal Crossing New Leaf was, I don't think anybody could have foretold that a cohort of people, roughly equivalent to the population of Spain, would set sail for New Horizons. Still, they and we can make some good guesses based on past performance. Mario Kart, Animal Crossing, Super Smash Bros., Zelda, 3D Mario, 2D Mario, Mario Party, and the generational Pokemon games were the titles capable of pushing into the 20 million plus territory at least once during the Switch's life. Granted, 2D Mario has yet to achieve that, but with Wonder already closing in on New Super Mario Bros. U Deluxe's 18.25 million number, and it being used as a pack-in with the original Switch, I think that Wonder will cross the 20 million threshold by the end of the Switch's life, although I hesitate to put a percentage figure on that forecast, if only because I think the emergence of a Nintendo Switch 2 edition could confuse matters and make it a difficult one to account for. In the second division of top evergreens, we have Switch Sports, Ring Fit, and other major Pokemon games like the remakes and Legends, plus Luigi's Mansion and Splatoon, as well as other second games in a generation for the top tier franchises, the Super Mario 3D World plus Bowser's Furies, for example. I have a separate project in development which goes into how Nintendo can move its franchises up a tier, but for now, let's consider Nintendo's broad approaches to these games. Their system lifespan can basically be divided into sections. The early days for Switch 2 will be when it's the only Switch 2 model on the market. This will be a relatively short period, and they clearly will want to get a good number of evergreens onto the shelf here. They've actually been quite sneaky about using the Nintendo Switch 2 editions to give themselves a leg up here. I know that many people will already own Super Mario Party Jamboree, Zelda Breath of the Wild, and Zelda Tears of the Kingdom, but the nature of evergreen titles is that they will continue to appeal, and new people will be interested in buying them. And so by adding these titles alongside Mario Kart World, Nintendo already have a good lineup of evergreens on day one. If they add a few more big titles to this lineup over 2026 and 2027, it will take them to their second key point in the system's life, the arrival of the lower cost light equivalent system. Now here we may see a divergence from the structure of the Switch graph that we see here, because without the warping effects of COVID, Nintendo may seek to maintain a steadier cadence of major evergreen game releases. Having said that, I rather doubt it. I think it suits Nintendo to let the dust settle a little mid-generation, giving themselves the leeway for a second major surge around the time of the mid-gen refresh model. Whether it's another OLED-style minor refresh or a big-time new 3DS XL type upgrade, it will suit them to have a few more big games to go to. How many of these games can we realistically expect, and when? I'd be surprised if we had more than one major Mario Kart in a generation. Quirky spin offs are possible, remember Mario Kart Live Home Circuit, and I think that before the generation is done, they may even do something to try to sell Mario Kart 8 Deluxe as new to the younger Switch 2 audience, who have only known 5, 6, 7 years of Mario Kart World by that point. But basically, Mario Kart World is a generational game. So too is Animal Crossing. 3D Mario and Zelda are in much the same boat, although both titles do have a little bit of a second string to their bow in the form of potential remakes, Ocarina of Time and Super Mario Galaxy 2 being particularly optimal possibilities. And of course, there's the potential for the teams to subdivide and support multiple concurrent projects in the style of Game Freak's Pokemon team, who will surely continue to march to the beat of their own drum. Splatoon is harder to call. 2 games per generation as precedent, and frankly, I'd still expect this kind of pace, since the profit structure of the game relies on people renewing their purchases of the game on a fairly regular basis. On the other hand, Splatoon Raiders does give Nintendo some degree of a buffer to do a major generational defining Splatoon a little bit later into the Switch 2's life. In the case of 2D Mario, it is clearly plausible to make more of these titles than they do, but the new Super Mario Bros. Series proves the potential diminishing returns this can provide if the innovation isn't there. I mean, don't get me wrong, New Super Mario Bros. U Deluxe was still a huge seller and did incredibly well between the port and the original on Wii U, but I think 2 per generation is probably the maximum for this series, and potentially it could be even less if they decide to expand Wonder to get the most out of it and then give another tilt to the Mario Maker franchise in between. Nintendo will also want to nudge other franchises into the catbird seat, as they did in the Switch 1 generation with Luigi's Mansion and Ring Fit Adventure, which both scored huger sales than they had ever had before. And of course, Ring Fit didn't exist before, but did at least pick up the mantle of previous fitness titles on Nintendo systems. And of course, they seem clearly trying to be attempting this with Donkey Kong Bonanza for the Switch 2. Obviously, Super Smash Bros. And Zelda are the wildest of wildcards here, as the teams could potentially have only started these titles in the last couple of years, if, in the case of Sakurai's team, they've even started at all. If the next Super Smash Bros. Title isn't due until perhaps 2029 or 2030, then it will be the major game of whichever year it's released in, and consoles do need these kinds of major tentpole titles to stave off the signs of fatigue. The Switch was nearly as old in 2023 as it was in 2024, and yet the difference between a year with Zelda Tears of the Kingdom, Pikmin 4, Super Mario Bros. Wonder, and more, with the following year where the tentpole titles were Zelda Echoes of Wisdom and Super Mario Party Jamboree, well, it was night and day. All told then, if Switch 2 can broadly keep track with the sales profile of its predecessor, then Nintendo will have perhaps a dozen games with 20 million plus potential, and they will need to space them out considerably, but not necessarily evenly. The first 3 or 4 years will require a steady pace of these releases, especially around the holiday season. But after the first revision is out, I think we can expect the rate of these kinds of titles to slow, with sudden surges around big time releases of hardware and otherwise a steady but intermittent pace of big evergreens. We can kind of anticipate that Zelda and Super Smash Bros. Are going to be set for the later generation period, probably alongside a new Super Mario Bros. Title as well. We can probably expect Splatoon, Animal Crossing, some kind of fitness or sports title, and probably a major placeholder Zelda like an Ocarina of Time port to come a bit earlier. Super Mario Party and Pokemon can continue their regular rhythms, and if we anticipate Pokemon in 2026 and remakes or Legends games in 2028 and 2029, as well as Super Mario Party games at the current 3 yearly schedule, then we could expect 2027 and 2030 releases of Mario Party, meaning that there is going to be at least one major title for the rest of the decade of either Super Mario Party or Pokemon, taking care of one big evergreen slot each year. Luigi's Mansion and a 3D Mario title are slightly more ambitious, but one or other feels bound to show up sooner rather than later. Here's the thing though, Nintendo does have the control to hit the gas or pump the brakes on their pacing. They may wish to do this because, as with during COVID, they've had enough sales anyway that they can afford to keep their powder dry. They may decide that they need to expedite titles to market, and I think there's a reason to suspect that we've seen this before, with at least Xenoblade Chronicles 2 and Kirby Star Allies releasing at an earlier stage than later Switch titles might have done, and of course they were both refined considerably post-launch. If Nintendo decides to slow their roll significantly, it could suggest that they are anticipating a very long generation and want to space out their games within it. But what will be really interesting is if they do hold back some very big guns indeed. Let's say a new Mario or Zelda, or even both. Because one thing Nintendo likes to have up its sleeve is a break glass in case of emergency system seller. Most notably, Zelda U rode to the rescue of Nintendo as the launch game for Wii U. If Nintendo decides to keep Mario, Zelda, and Smash all in their back pocket for mid-gen, whether through design or just happenstance, it will give them the ultimate insurance policy for the success of Switch 2, something I don't think is in particular doubt, but Nintendo wouldn't have known this when they were making this plan. They could have a major game to put behind the innovative new mid-generation Nintendo Egg console or Nintendo Mind Pyramid or whatever weird thing that they could want to put out as a side console, as they once did with the DS and indeed the Switch. I'm not saying for a second I expect this, but if you were Shuntaro Furukawa thinking many moves ahead and contingency planning for a Switch 2 failure from the vantage point of 2024, then having such games in the back pocket for mid-generation, well, that's not the worst thing in the world. Let me know your thoughts, and thanks as ever for watching. If you wish to like, share, comment, subscribe, and or check out the Patreon, I'd really appreciate it, but if not, I'm just so happy you're here, and I'll see you next time for another Nintendo Forecast.